Hi, everyone. Hi, hello, we're going to get started. Welcome to today's DiaTalk program on this very cold but lovely community-free day. My name is Alexis Lowry. I'm an associate curator here at Dia, and I work on the DiaTalks program, programming our speakers. Before we begin, I want to thank quickly everybody at Dia who has worked really hard to make this event possible, particularly our visitor services staff, but also Kathleen Anderson, Alex Vargo, Megan Mattingly, Francesca Garbo, and Dan Wolf, who's going to make sure we can hear Jane's lovely talk. I hope that some of you have already had the chance to see our most recent installation that opened today, the Walter Di Maria installation, and if you haven't, please do after the talk. This focused exhibition introduces viewers to the distinctive forms, techniques, and idiosyncratic imagery of Di Maria's early work, practices and themes that develop early in his practice but which sustain him throughout his career and which are fundamental to more monumental projects like the Vertical Kilometer, the Lightning Field, and the New York Earth Room, which were all commissioned by Dia and which celebrate their 40th anniversary this year. So we're excited about that. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Jane McFadden, whose most recent book, Meaningless Work, or Walter Di Maria, Meaningless Work, explores the breadth of Di Maria's dynamic practice. In this incisive analysis of McFadden argues that through work that operates between different media, Di Maria privileges experience over discursive meaning. That's a quote from her. Through an experientially grounded practice that's rooted in a peculiar temporality that is, as Jane describes it, brief but intense in time and focus, so like the time of a rendezvous. Di Maria's art ventured to change how, quote, contemporary methods of seeing and attention were experienced. Often operating at the threshold of visibility, such as the Gothic drawings in our current installation do, Di Maria's work engages audiences in an exploration of the limits of perception. And through her own analysis of Di Maria's work and the event, especially the early event score type written works, the drawings and the sculptures, McFadden similarly opens up new avenues of art historical inquiry. For example, inviting us to reconsider the genealogy of site-specific art that underpins so many of the magnificent and monumental works in Dia's collection. So with that, I will say, very briefly, the nuts and bolts. Jane McFadden is an art historian in the chair of the Humanities and Sciences at Art Center College of Design in California. A prolific writer, her essays have appeared in Art Journal, Grey Room, Modern Painters, and Extra. And recent writing has brought attention to important but under-recognized artists such as Marcia Hafif and Michelle Stewart. She's contributed to numerous catalogs, including Pacific Standard Time at the Paul J. Getty and Ends of the Earth, Land Art to 1974, at the Museum of Contemporary Art, also in Los Angeles. And her recent book, Walter Di Maria, Meaningless Work, for which she received a Creative Capital Warhol Foundation Art Writers Grant, was published last year in 2016 by Reaction Books. So with that, help me welcome Jane.
Thank you, Alexis. I'm going to get some water. It's so lovely to be here in this lovely room on this cold afternoon. Thank you to Alexis for inviting me here, to Jessica, Francesca, Dan, and the entire staff at the Dia for their wonderful hospitality. I'm really honored to be here, pleased to be here. When Alexis first contacted me about coming for this talk, she mentioned, as she just did again in her introduction, that one of the impetuses for this invitation was that it was the 40th anniversary of some of Di Maria's major works, especially The Lightning Field, that was completed in 1977. It was also about 22 years ago that I first visited there, and in fact, this invitation coincided with and marks a possible last stop on what's really been, one way or another, 2 decades of thinking about Di Maria, stemming from that first visit to the work in New Mexico, which took place on a road trip for me between graduate school in Austin, Texas, and summer work as a wilderness ranger in the Wasatch Range and the Uinta National Forest. Some of what I will share today can be found in the recent book, which she mentioned, which was really the culmination of that work. But I'm also really, really grateful for a chance to think again and anew about DiMaria here. And one way that we might understand this talk is the kind of, or one way that I approach the talk is, what would I say or how would I introduce viewers to an array of possibility for thinking about the installation of the I Ching? That first trip to the lightning field for me was also my first significant Western road trip, that quintessential American journey that's distinct. My trip was distinct from, but related to, the sojourns that informed so many of DiMaria's generation. As he noted of his own cross-country jaunt in the late 60s, quote, "It was the greatest sculptural experience of my life," end quote. Indeed, on my own trip, the space of West Texas was so massive, hypnotizing, and astounding that, lulled by the unending stretch of highway and my own personal soundtrack, I drove my tank of gas dry. Eventually arriving at the work, the lightning field was, as has been experienced by many visitors and recounted by numerous historical and critical commentators, a significant experience unlike any other I had had in the presence of art. The lightning field marked an in-between space for me, literally and figuratively, between the intellectual research of a student and the physical knowledge of a ranger, between institutions of culture and the culture of nature, between intense mental focus and a more meditative kind of experience. It was during that time that I started describing DiMaria, when the opportunity arose, as a believer, one who had avoided the supposed turn to irony of the late 20th century, and who maintained faith in the potential of art to create a profound experience, to create a space of strangeness and encounter for the viewer, despite the odds against it. In the swirl of early 1990s debates about our grand fin de siècle entrance into a virtual world, which turned out to be decidedly more disappointing, I might add, this belief seemed possibly embarrassing. Of course, by now you may realize I'm consciously mimicking, although authentically relating to, the tendency of this work to evoke the personal narrative. Most critical commentary on it does so. The lightning field in its cool, precise geometric form, approximately 1 mile by 1 kilometer, with a level plane across the surface of its gridded points, is a frame for our experience. Monumental, yet nuanced, it creates a grid in which we live for 24 hours, associating art with expansive space and duration. Perhaps even more shocking now, 20 or 40 years later, in an age of instant updates in Google Earth, from which it cannot be seen, I might add. The 1993 rather smaller version or model, there's a small sculptural form in the DiMaria room here that's on view. It's entitled Gold and Silver Lightning Field. This smaller sculpture literalizes this sense of reflection as it frames our own image. If you look at it, you'll catch yourself there. And also metaphorically speaks to its precious value, like gold or silver. The notches in the sculptural form, the little dots in that sculptural form, are able to evoke a greater dimensionality of the grid without material verticality, which would be the poles in the original lightning field. And it relates to DiMaria's longstanding interest in, quote, the notion of lines traveling out to infinite points from the sculpture, end quote. Here, we might understand sculpture as a type of three-dimensional drawing, starting in form but moving through space. In turn, the grid is a frame and a field for the figure, for us, who, DiMaria once noted, activate the work like a, quote, hit. And I would say he probably did not accidentally allude to drugs in that metaphor. The advantage of an expansive horizontal space that his later works employ, not only the lightning field, but many of his other array sculptures, like the 2000 sculpture or the 360-degree I Ching on view here, is the difficulty of grasping the work visually as an image or a whole. Consider Di Maria's description of Bed of Spikes from 1969, an early experimentation with the horizontal form. Quote, "Then the interesting part is that the perspective shifts, and when you're on the short side, you see 7, 6 passageways, 7 rows of spikes. Then moving around the other way, you see 13 rows, and then you see all the spatial variations of these diagonal ranks that form 2, so that spatially, it's really a successful piece for reading the sculpture in the total round," end quote. Or, as he noted, people will really have to see these pieces. Di Maria then guaranteed or encouraged the viewer's attention through less visible psychological aspects that these fields allow and encourage. At the lightning field, we're isolated, possibly with strangers, acutely attuned over time. For Bed of Spikes, one had to sign a release acknowledging the violent potential of the work's sharp spikes, another kind of awareness. Di Maria, danger, Juan, the ads for the show provoked. A film he made of Bed of Spikes suggests another kind of scene, 3 short clips with classical soundtracks and dramatic lighting, metaphorically and somewhat comically, militarize the piece, evoking the genre war film as the sculptural spikes become so many soldiers marching in melodramatic display. I really want us to pause here and try to grapple with the simultaneous darkness of a sculpture that might kill you and humor of his genre film clips of it, a pairing that shows up in his Western hardcore of that same year, 1969, which began with a hilarious cowboy ditty and ends with the deadpan stare of a young Asian girl, a not-so-subtle nod to the civilian casualties of all war, but particularly Vietnam. Deeply critical of the socio-political conditions of his time, as well as sculptural doctrine, Di Maria noted, "I keep wanting to say 5 things at once. That's the real reason you make art, I think, to say 5 or 10 things at once, just like that." Nowhere was this flexibility and contingency more apparent than in his drawings. Di Maria had a prolific practice of drawing, the constituent elements of which were sparse, lightly sketched lines, almost always on the edge of visibility, or what he called the threshold of visibility. They were resistant to reproduction, almost impossible to photograph. Di Maria described these works as being invisible drawings. Even in the presence of some of these works, it's difficult to discern where exactly a line starts. And I really mean, I have sat in front of these drawings and looked at them, and I can't see the end of a line. It's quite extraordinary. They demand an intimate material experience. At the same time, his drawings contained a multiplicity of references across an array of subjects: cats, UFOs, country and westerns, pornography, landscape, among other things. He also played with the interrelation of drawings and subjects over time and in 2 and 3 dimensions, an infinitely flexible medium. For example, a spare 2-line drawing was titled "The Only Minimal Sculpture Ever Created." And it encapsulated the spatial and temporal possibilities of drawing as sculpture, which you see everywhere around you, really, at the Dia, and also echoed with his own early chalk drawings on the desert that were sort of these massive sculptural forms. This drawing could in turn be construed as part of a project, this minimal sculptural drawing, as a part of a project named in another drawing of the same series from the same day, first possibility of a 1-year project to just draw nothing but 2 lines. And in this way, we might also think about calendar hanging up in the gallery, this sort of idea of a 1-year durational relationship to working. The Gothic drawings on view here further elucidate these kinds of possibilities, acting as drawing, frame, even a series of windows, perhaps. At his 1965 exhibition at Paula Johnson, now Cooper, he had exhibited large relief sculptural frames with small openings that are sort of similar to the way the Gothic drawings work. So if you haven't been in to see the Gothic drawings, they're shaped frames, and then inside are these very small, almost imperceptible drawings of the same shape. And so when he made these relief sculptures in '65, there were these very large frames, but the opening was also very small. So it's roughly contemporary, same kind of structure, one in drawing, one in wood. It was also at that exhibition at Paula Cooper, or Paula Johnson at the time, that he constructed a sculptural colonnaded entry that had a ritualized effect that we might align with the Gothic. Drawings inextricably linked to Di Maria's exploration. Drawings were, inextricably linked to Di Maria's explorations in the land as well. Adjusting its scale, he noted, quote, "The line in the invisible drawing is like the mirage of a heat wave on the desert floor. It's something that's there and not there. A yard-square piece of paper is an idea, a close approximation of the whole field of vision in a desert," end quote. Trying to come to terms with an imperceptible line on the page is like that of finding one's bearings in the desert. It's a realm where you, quote, "doubted your senses," end quote. Similarly, his investigations on the land were often couched as drawings. He wrote to Richard Bellamy, "Tomorrow, go out with pilot to dry lake and desert to photograph 2-mile-long chalk marks we will put down from 1 mile up, a beginning drawing of the walls." Here, the inscription in the desert, or putting down, is in concert with the drawing seen from 1 mile up, a massive three-dimensional gridding of our multiplying perspectives. However, Di Maria quickly abandons an interest in documenting the work and instead accepts the difficulty of seeing it, noting, "Invisible drawing was like the land work. It was there, but no one can see it." In fact, upon reflection within the annals of land art and earthworks that seem to anchor Di Maria's place in history, we discover that Di Maria's projects of the late 1960s, contemporary to the canonical double negative by Michael Heiser and Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, are not there. They have vanished. Sure, a couple of aerial photographs circulate for works few have ever found, some in chalk that blew away, but as Di Maria himself noted, quote, "Whether a work exists or only in its photographs, you can never know for certain, can you?" End quote. Di Maria made monumental works on the land that few can see. The lightning field itself provides no aerial view, no sign of human intervention in the landscape from above. Even standing within the work, a comprehension of the whole, as one may do for double negative or Spiral Jetty, is not really possible. Having to see, doubting your senses, invisible. These are terms crucial to understanding Di Maria's practice and what he valued. Let's listen. Di Maria's 1964 cricket music is a roughly 24-minute piece, and I'm going to play you a few minutes of it here. We're going to be joining it about halfway through where the drum track is well into session, and I'm going to let this sample go for a good little bit in order to, I think, give space and respect to the piece as Di Maria made it. Y'all did so well making it through that. Right? I've hypothesized that this piece might make a good soundtrack for DiMaria's early proposed land work of 2-mile-long parallel walls. They were going to be 8 feet high and 12 feet apart, in which the viewer would have been immersed in space with a limited and directed view, a focused attunement not unlike his minimal and durational tracks. Of course, we might consider the track an early work of land art in and of itself, one that allows for an expansive and meditative space. Terry Riley once remarked to me about this piece that, quote, Walter's discriminating ear heard the meeting point of the psychedelic pattern of cricket moire and matched it with the pulsing rhythms and high-pitched cymbals of his drum set, like a great static painting made manifest in sound, end quote. We could also align its potential with that of his invisible drawing, minimal form and maximum contingency. Music provides a realm of overlay for DiMaria between invisibility and representation, between linear form and expansive space, between presence and mediated experience, essential concerns of his practice. This track, Cricket Music, had in fact first been manifest as a live show, which DiMaria did, of 2 taped pieces, one of drums and one of cricket. So he played the 2 pieces simultaneously at the Café Au Go-Go in 1964, and then the work became a singular track later that year. I mean, that's pretty early to be playing with tape recorders. Anyway, it's not about firsts. Okay, at a time when DiMaria was also actively playing in bands, most famously with Lou Reed, he also understood the potential of recording technology. You might have noticed that the song is cut with an engine near the end, which is amazing to me, a choice that acknowledges that any sense of presence or place was accompanied by an elsewhere, whether brought about by the possibilities of the televisual or the jet age. This figuring of the spaces of nature with the technologies of travel reflects DiMaria's understanding of the relationship between the two. Any experience accumulates across media. Music was a realm in which the form of the work could overtake the viewer with sound all around you, a possibility that DiMaria understood through his early encounters with Lamont Young and also through the emergence of rock. It was the 1960s, after all. He expressed an interest in such overwhelming experience, equating swimming in the ocean, intense encounters with drugs, loud sound of music, with what he might want for art. Quote, if it doesn't match the powerful experience you've had in your life, then it isn't real work, end quote. But the technological possibilities of the era transformed our understanding of live performance in general. As DiMaria remarked, the symphony doesn't need to be there anymore. Art would then be a flickering possibility within this realm between presence and absence, visual and televisual, and DiMaria knew it. The late 1960s were filled for him with explorations of various media, music, film, photography, and their circulation, as his sculpture also underwent the shift from singular figure to a horizontal plane. In 1967, one of his last singular vertical sculptural figures, of which he made many, and so several are on display here. I'd say there was sort of in the mid-60s a series of sculptural forms that were vertical, stainless steel, very shiny, Palladio, column with a ball on top are in the room. And the one I'm going to discuss here briefly is Garbo, which was a 6 foot tall, so its scale was slightly different than the works in the room on the table, and a scale that really more clearly aligned it with the idea of the human figure. A 6 foot tall, thin stainless steel column inscribed with the titles of the films of the famous actress: Peter the Tramp, The Story of Gosta Berling, The Street of Sorrow, The Torrent, The Temptress, Flesh and the Devil, Love, The Divine Woman, The Mysterious Lady, A Woman of Affairs, Wild Orchids, The Single Standard, The Kiss, Anna Christie, Romance, Inspiration, Susan Lennox, her fall and rise, Mata Hari, Grand Hotel, As You Desire Me, Queen Christina, The Painted Veil, Anna Karenina, Camille, Conquest, Ninochka, Two-Faced Woman. The abstract minimal form of the sculpture stands in tension with the ethereal virtual spaces of the silver screen, listed here in their evocative poetics, manifesting fear, death, and desire, metaphorical lines traveling out from the sculpture. The gendering of this work, both slender and glittering, full of feminine possibility in women in transient states, while also hard and phallic, evoked the contingency of form and figure. The actress Greta Garbo was similarly transitive, moving from one guise to another. Garbo also embodied celebrity, a condition that made her ubiquitously present and unknowable. In turn, the work's reflective surface played against each possible manifestation, the screen of cinema, the mirage of celebrity, and the ambiguity of any portrait. Like its namesake, the sculpture was two-faced. Di Maria noted, quote, "That brings up a crucial problem that our art shares with celebrities like Elizabeth Taylor or Richard Nixon, whether a work, a celebrity, exists or only in its photographs," end quote. Di Maria was quietly challenging the object of art against the screens of media and celebrity in 1967. It is also the same year he alludes to sculpture as a con in his work Melville. Both Melville and Garbo were shown in 1968 at Nicholas Wilder Gallery in Los Angeles, for which he took his cross-country road trip, and after which he went to the desert. We might think of Di Maria's later sculptural work of horizontal expanse as a way to get our bearings in this world, not only on our field of vision, but on the field of media and its cons. Di Maria's expansive forms allow us to take measure of our world even as they remind us of the limitations of such an endeavor, of the discrepancies between what we see and what we know. Broken Kilometer in Manhattan, Buried Kilometer in Kassel, the Equal Area series on view here not so long ago, each pushes mathematical measurement against what we experience. What is a kilometer to me here now? How do we know it is buried? What are the mathematics of equality? The I Ching, with its connections to ancient Chinese cultures, is more direct in its assertion of an invisible socio-political, philosophical field that shadows his work. Allusions proliferate from the abstract form. Airfields and cemeteries, especially military, come to mind. Yet here, these evocations are held in check by a pattern of possibility in the hexagrams themselves. We know the I Ching to be of interest to Di Maria's art historical generation, though I have found no record of an abiding interest by Di Maria himself. He was interested in China, its history, its poetry, proposing 3 works for LACMA's Art and Technology program that addressed the country. He later placed a young Chinese girl at the end of his Western hardcore, as I alluded to obliquely above, a gesture that then perhaps moves beyond that initial reading of Vietnam that I mentioned to the role and abuse of Chinese labor in America's manifest destiny, so often depicted in the genre of the Western. Di Maria once remarked that he wanted to make a full-length film of China, on China. And I wondered, in preparing for this talk, if 360-degree I Ching was not in some way the manifestation of that idea. It would be appropriate. If drawing is sculpture and film is drawing, each of his films that he made in the late 60s he describes as a series of circles, and they were made with sort of a film going in a 360-degree rotation. Why can't sculpture be film? Taken in over time, like he filmed his own Bed of Spikes. Indeed, the 64 hexagrams arrived at through throws of coins or sticks speak to the arbitrary patterns of history around which his own work circles. An ancient and enigmatic text aligned with the idea of invisible energies, where causality is replaced by invisible but powerful synchronic forces, is an entirely suitable form for DiMaria's investigations, saying 5 things at once, just like that. My own copy of the I Ching was a present from my first art history mentor, Christine Stiles, in the early 1990s, and I got it out with her notes and threw it for this occasion, arriving at the following configuration of hexagrams. 20, Quan, contemplation or view. The hexagram represents a tower that commands a view and can also be seen from afar, thus representing both contemplating and being seen. 12, Pi, stand still. They bear and endure. Heaven and earth are out of communion and all things are benumbed. I have to note that I also tried to teach the I Ching to my son this month and threw it a second time, getting those 2 above hexagrams out of 64 again. Make of that coincidence what you will. And finally, 35, Chen, progress. The sun rising over the earth, a time of ever-widening expansion and clarity. Such readings situate my experience in the gallery within the broader movement of historical time. As DiMaria noted, quote, history and a sense of time are at the core of my work, end quote. The I Ching is a reminder that arrangements come and go, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. And as in all DiMaria's work, the invisible remains. Energies, reflections, contingencies provide different kinds of measure for our world of so many images. Indeed, it seems more and more apparent every day that the social and material demands of American life as they stand cannot be sustained, and thus the invisible might be nothing short of radical in our contemporary culture. Of course, certain invisibilities provide cover for the worst forms of prejudice, and others provide liberating forms of retrospection and privacy. Both demand that we choose to see and value differently. As DiMaria said of his early column with a ball on top, and I really think it's about the 4x4 8-piece in the room there, I have built a box 8 feet high. On top, place a small gold ball. Of course, no one will be able to see the ball sitting way up there on the box. I will just know it is there. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Listening to the crickets, there was a 3-beat all through there, and I heard that this summer in my backyard one night, listening to the crickets. I spent all the time, and I was impressed with the 3 beats. But now, taking that, I'm curious what the connection might be with the I Ching, because we're talking there about trigrams constructing into hexagrams. And I notice also with the rods that he has there, if you cut them down the center in half, you end up with a triangular form. So there's triadic all over the place. And I'm wondering if you can document a connection temporarily or whatever between the 2 works.
A short answer is no, but I think that DiMaria's investigation, especially in conjunction with Lamont Young, of the sort of potent power of and contingency and complexity that comes from a sort of set, minimal beat or tone or later drone, especially in just intonation and the contingencies that emerge, I think are really what were informing his construction of these tracks. So he makes cricket music in '64 and ocean music in '69, which is the soundtrack to his Western hardcore as well. I think he's really coming out of that tradition. At the same time, he's also constantly exploring mathematical relationships and possibilities, and some of these are available and apparent in the I Ching. I haven't really thought about how to track that relationship, but I think it could be done for sure. But I can't. So yes, but I haven't thought about it in that way. Really? Not that I know of. Elizabeth, do you know of any other works that refer to the I Ching? To China, yes, but I Ching, no. He did a drawing of the Great Wall of China, and he taught. I mean, my understanding is he studied Asian history in high school. He was a child of San Francisco. I think he always had an interest in that culture, and he talks about it pretty regularly in the '60s in the few public recordings of his conversations, but not that I know of. But it was around. I mean, people were playing with the I Ching regularly throughout the '60s.
Is there anything beyond this mention of the desire to make the film about China, or anything that is just
He says in an interview, I want to make a full-length film of China, and he says it's going to be maybe about the Opium Wars, but nothing else. That I've found. I mean, that's the other thing about Di Maria. There's. Oh, I don't know. Actually, I haven't. I wrote this talk having never seen the I Ching in person. I have to. It wasn't until I got here that I could put the two together. And so, are they in order? Yeah. Yeah. They're in order. Yes.
First of all, I enjoyed your lecture. You speak like a poet, which was nice. Do you have any insights or comments you can talk about the use of volume and density in his work, which seems to be something that I see kind of as a pattern? Sometimes we'll see metal, which is highly dense, often on installations that are inside. And sometimes volume and density is created by the projection of a grid, as in terms of the lightning field. And sometimes volume is created by the film pieces in terms of the rotation. Have you thought about that, or do you have any comments on that? On that, because it's a lot of different materials that are used, in my opinion, to scale up very quick volumes.
Yeah, I think. The metal works, which you describe as dense, they also dissipate pretty quickly because they're so shiny and so reflective. I mean, so even the most, and maybe I spoke to this a little bit with Garbo, this sort of most hard, cool, dense steel work seems to invite a certain kind of immateriality or invisibility or reflect. I mean, ideas like reflection, mirage, invisibility, these things come up and circulate even around something that seems so obdurantly there. And people talk about this in terms of the lightning field too. Under the right conditions, the poles just disappear, right? So it's this, and I think makes it very particular within that history of work because it's so ethereal and nuanced and subtle, despite the fact that it's also monumental. So that's sort of, I would sort of immediately even take the works that seem like they might be more dense and situate them over in this idea of expanding volume, this idea of things traveling out. And for example, Palladio, that's on view in the room, and there's so many other things to say about like Di Maria. A colleague of mine's written a lot on Di Maria and homage. I mean, if you just take a list of people he made works about, It's pretty interesting, and so is Palladio, who sort of accidentally or intuitively almost always came back around to something approximating the golden measure, but not quite. That work in its vertical and horizontal form, immediately becomes so much larger and activates the space around it and the reflecting back. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but. Yeah.
Do you have anything else that would be maybe interesting to know about his use of spheres? It seems like they are very constant in a lot of his work.
His spheres? In his later work, yeah.
I was thinking, and I'm not sure if the work Time, Timeless, No Time at the Chichu Art Museum.
Which I have not seen. The best thing I can tell you to do is another colleague of mine, James Nisbet, just published a piece in Art Bulletin, and he speaks to Di Maria and the spheres, and he makes this really great analysis of the difference between a globe and a sphere, and he's trying to get a handle on this issue of the sort of socio-political in Di Maria, and he comes around to that, and I think that would be the best way for me to answer your question. I think it's, and if you get my email from someone, I'll send it to you. What? Yes?
Jane,
Yes.
the lightning field was now 40 years old.
Yes.
Where it's situated in New Mexico 40 years ago, was there nothing for miles around of the site? And is there development that has somehow encroached on it over the decades?
I think some of the DIA staff might be able to speak to this more clearly than I can. My understanding is that Di Maria chose it for its isolation, for the electrical activity, possible electrical activity. He was trying out different sites. Of course, there are the logistics of actually getting a site. And I do or have heard tales or conversations about issues with development and things that might be seen from the work that would interfere with it, but I don't know but it hadn't, not that it had happened, but there were concerns about it. So, and I don't know how that's being handled in terms of buying up land around it, and Jessica might be able to speak to this.
Just briefly, it is something we're very conscious of, and there has been a process over the years of buying land around. We did a viewshed study some years ago in order to understand what would encroach visually on your relationship between the piece and anything that might appear around it. And so we spend quite a bit of time thinking about that and making sure that nothing will encroach. Some work was done on the land, but it was more to do with bringing things underground that were above ground in terms of wiring and so forth. But as Jane says, it was chosen for its relative lack of construction or any kind of visible buildings in the surrounding area. But it obviously it is something that's a great concern to us, and so we make sure that it doesn't happen.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Sorry.
I was just wondering, it's a bit of a tangential question, but do you know why the Ching were vandalized when they were first shown in Paris? And they had to close the exhibition a while ago?
No, but
Not that I was said, but I think it was somebody who was not well who entered the space. In fact, the space was not to be entered, so that person shouldn't have entered the space. You saw it from above. So it was just a sort of unfortunate occurrence where somebody who was mentally unstable entered into the space. But yeah. Yes, no, it wasn't it, no. No.
Thank you, Jane, so much for
thank
this.
you. It's my pleasure.